Wonderful. Thank you so much. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Shana Tova U'Metuka. It's that time of year. It's the Shabbat before Rosh Hashanah, and we are reading Parashat Nitzavim-Vayeilech. So why did I say Parashat? Because we actually have two parshas this week, Nitzavim and Vayelech. So what I'm going to do, as we typically do in this, is I'm going to first kind of give a little bit of an overview of where we are. And then we're going to look mostly at Deuteronomy 30. So just kind of have that in your mind. We're going to do a little bit of some work with some verses in Deuteronomy 30, 11 through 14, I believe it is. And I just want to kind of frame where we are. Nitzavim literally means standing. You are standing here this day. You are gathered here this day. We've just finished this series of really, really difficult curses in Kitavo last week. We unfortunately have a little bit of that continuing this week, and particularly in Nitzavim. But we're really getting to a point of Moshe concluding his speech to Bnei Israel, particularly in Vayelech, but I think we really get that in Nitzavim as well. And in Nitzavim, we have a couple of themes emerging. I kind of like to think of this as this is like the, final summation, conclusion of the speech. Moshe is reminding us of where we've been and where we're going. And we're also reminded of this covenant that we are entering into, all of us. And it specifically says at the very beginning of our parsha that everyone is here, everyone, including those who are physically present on Hayom, today, this day, as well as those who are not. So this is a covenant that is beyond temporality, beyond time, and beyond geography, beyond space. We also have a beautiful idea in verse 10 of chapter 29 which we're not going to look at inside, but I'll just kind of give you a little summation of, that everyone is present, from the wood drawer to the water carrier, the entire community, in other words, everyone regardless. And then in Vayelech, we actually have this idea kind of reiterated where we learn about the Hakel, which was a ceremony that happened every 7th year during Sukkot. And during that time, everyone from the entire community would be gathered together to read the entire Torah together. Everyone of all genders, children, everyone in the community would be gathered every 7 years to hear the Torah and to be able to live by the Torah. So we have a lot of themes that are contiguous between Nitzavim and Vayelech. The idea of covenant, the idea that the covenant is here for us, the idea of Moshe, really, especially in Vayelech, Moshe talks about this, but the transfer of power from Moshe to Yehoshua, from Moshe to Joshua, the recollection that Moshe has that his days are numbered, the recollection that Moshe has that he's not going to be able to enter the land. And it's really, I like to think of these parshiot as Moshe's swan song. That this is really Moshe giving us a charge, a directive, and also, more specifically, really reminding us of, like, he's finite and his days are numbered, and we're going to have a new way of being in the world after Moshe passes away. So I want to invite us to move in our learning together. We're going to look at, I'm going to find it in my own Chumash, we're going to look at Deuteronomy chapter 30, and we're going to look at verse, let me just make sure I have the number correct. We're going to look at verse, I believe verse 11. Just triple checking that real quick. Thank you for bearing with me, everyone, for a second. Yes, we're going to look at verse 11. We're going to look at verses particularly 11 through 14, and then we're going to skim down a little bit if we have time into a little bit later on. So if you're able to share screen, Deuteronomy 30, verse 11.
Sure. Just 1 second.
That'd be awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks all. And repeat which verse again?
Verse 11, chapter 30.
Great. Okay, here we are. And for those asking for the link, I will share that in just a moment also.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I am sorry that I did not think about to cue that up sooner. Thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate it. We really appreciate it. So can we have a reader who is able to read in the English verses 11 through 14?
Folks are invited to raise their Zoom hand because
Oh,
unfortunately.
yes, please. Thank you. Folks are invited to raise their Zoom hands.
Thank you, Ginny.
Can you go up a little bit to 11?
Oh, yes. Apologies.
That's okay. Surely this instruction which I enjoin upon you this day is not too baffling for you, nor is it beyond reach. It is not in the heavens that you should say, who among us can go up to the heavens and get it for us and impart it to us that we may observe it. Nor is it beyond the sea that you should say, who among us has to cross to the other side of the sea and get it for us and impart it to us that we may observe it? No, the thing is very close to you, in your mouth and in your heart, to observe it.
Thank you. Thank you, Jenny, so much. And what's so interesting to me about how often these verses are translated is that there are some ways in which the translators, as I've said, if those of you who've learned with me before, know that translation is inherently commentary, right? And that we can't really translate directly from one language to another. That we do our level best, but in the end, whenever we're translating, we're actually also commenting. So if we look at verse 11, for example, in the Hebrew, it says, כי המצווה הזאת אשר אנוכי מצווה היום. So because this mitzvah gets translated as instruction, but we could even say this command, or this, if you even want to go even more insight to that, like this connection, this way of being in the world, this instruction that I have instructed you, that I have given you, that I've commanded you, more literally, it's not a wonderment to you. Lo niflati, right? It's not lo niflati. It's not a wonderment, or not like a bafflement is an interesting way to translate that, because I think there's another way we can understand this, as Moshe is saying, the mitzvot, it's not this thing that is like distant and really hard. It's actually right here, right? It's not in the heavens so that we have to have someone else go and get it, right? So there's no intermediary. I think that's one of the things that we're being taught here, that actually access to this covenant, access to Torah and mitzvot is not dependent on somebody else having to go to the heavens, so that we would say, Miyaleh lanu hashemaima, and to take it for us, right? Who's going to take this for us is a one way to kind of translate the Hebrew. And who's going to hear it and listen to it and be able to kind of give it over to us. It's actually right here. And what this brings back to me when I'm thinking about this verse in particular, interesting that we have the Shemayim and the Yam here in these verses, because what's so interesting is that we're in a way being reminded of Yetziat Mitzrayim, of the Exodus, of the crossing of the Yam Suf, of the Sea of Reeds, and even Revelation, because in Exodus 19 and 20, when we are receiving revelation at Sinai, the people actually have a moment of panic where they're like, this is too much. This thunder and lightning and these voices and the smoking and the mountain shaking, this is too much for us. This theophany is a fancy word for this revelation of the divine, this encounter with the divine. This is too much. Please, Moshe, go up. So what happens? Moshe actually goes up the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. And then the people, again, and I think we talked about this when we learned Exodus together, the people get really freaked out because Moshe is gone and he doesn't come back when they expect him to. And what happens when he doesn't come back? They build the golden calf. And Aaron ostensibly gives permission for that, although then kind of Aaron backtracks on that. But ostensibly, there's a certain sense of Moshe's gone. We don't know what's happened to this person that we're following, and we need a God to worship. We're going to create this golden calf. And then, of course, there's a major rupture. And what's really interesting is that Yom Kippur is understood as the day in which there was a repair, that the second set of tablets was finished and there was that repair from that rupture. And in fact, on Yom Kippur, we say the 13 attributes, which were taken directly from Exodus 34 in the aftermath of what is understood in our tradition to be the greatest rupture between us and Hashem. So that is an interesting metaphor around the heavens. You don't have to have somebody go and get it for you. I don't need to go up the mountain, right? I don't need to go up the mountain to get it. It's right here. And it's not on the other side of the sea. It's not across the sea so that you might say, who is going to go and get it for us, right? How am I going to cross this expanse? Thinking again about the beginning of the Parsha, where Moshe kind of recounts again, we were in Egypt and we experienced all these things, and then we emerged from that place, and now we are moving towards across the Jordan to the land, and these mitzvot, this Torah, this brit, this covenant, you don't need to have someone cross a great expanse to get it for you. In fact, it is right here. It is embodied. It is in your mouth and in your heart to do it. And what I wanted to say there about to do it is that in the translations that we often use, la'asoto, the word there, la'asoto, which of course is the infinite form, the possessive form of the verb to do, to make. And that's what's so interesting is that root in Hebrew, ayin sin hay, that root is often understood as to do or to make. So it's unique and kind of an interesting way to translate that, to say to observe it, right? I think that there's a much more embodied, much more intimate or imminent sense of what Moshe is inviting us into, right? Which is this notion of this covenant, something that I think makes our tradition really unique, the Jewish tradition really unique, is that the understanding of the relationship between the individual and the covenant is direct, right? When we think about rabbis, and I often find as a rabbi myself that I have to explain this to people, right? Rabbis are not in any way intermediaries. Rabbis are teachers of Jewish law and teachers of Jewish life, and have had years and years of study, and that is really important. But in terms of accessing the covenant or accessing divine, a rabbi is a teacher in the way it's kind of like, this is somebody who's an expert in a particular thing. And I think that expertise is, very important, as it is in lots of other fields as well, right? There's value in that kind of human endeavor. And that doesn't make that person somehow elevated, right? Now, we're not going to go here today, but of course we can, acknowledge that as the Jewish tradition evolved over time, there are and have been and continue to be communities that really have a relationship with what they call tzaddikim, or righteous ones, who do have in their understanding a little bit of a greater access point. I would argue that normatively speaking, the Jewish tradition is very much, particularly when we look at these verses, very much emphatic that in fact, everyone has that equal access to do these mitzvot. It's available, it's here, it's right here in your heart and in your mouth. That you don't, and that's not to say that we don't keep the Torah. I mean, it actually, hahafach, the opposite of that, right? That the Torah, it's ours, it's here. We have the ability to observe it. We have the ability to do so in community and in alignment with our particular tradition and teachers. And we all come from lots of different backgrounds here. So, all of those Jewish lineages that lead us to this Torah that is ours, all of those are right here in our mouths and in our hearts to do it. What I think is particularly beautiful about this idea, especially as we're moving into Rosh Hashanah imminently, is that, we have that opportunity to renew. That's exactly what we're being invited into in Rosh Hashanah, that we are invited to renew this year. We're invited to make it new. We're invited to, Hayom Harat Olam. Today is the birthday of the world. We're invited to create that newness for ourselves, just as happens in secular culture, New Year's Eve, New Year's Day, and the secular calendar. So too, I think that's what we are invited into here. And I think that there's something really interesting about this idea that Moses is giving over. And I think, there's a lot of different ways to understand it as well. There's also part of me really empathizes with Moshe, and that maybe he's even suggesting, like, it's not all on me. You can do this, and I think about all my teachers, and I think about myself, and how sometimes people will often think like, oh, you have all the expertise, it's all on you. But actually thinking of like, how do we build our individual pathways with Torah? How do we find that closeness, whatever that means for us, right? That's not only the purview of the rabbis, that's not only the purview of the cantors or the ones that have a lot of learning. It's actually the purview of each and every one of us, which is a very Hasidic idea. Also, the Baal Shem Tov, one of the radical innovations of the Hasidic movement when it began in the 18th century in Ukraine, was that, or what is now Ukraine, was that basically the Baal Shem Tov, Israel Baal Shem, also known as Israel Master of the Good Name, made the argument that joyful Judaism is available, and that this kind of simple worship is available. And I think that there's a way in which there can be a line from the Torah into, reminding us that this covenant is right here. It's in our hearts and it's in our mouths and in our hearts to do it. We are going to look at a couple of other verses, but I actually, before we do so, I would like to pause here for a few moments and just invite questions, feedback, comments. Please try to keep your comments to the text. Please try to keep them concise, and so we can hear from as many people as possible. And the way we'll do that is either you raise your Zoom hand or you can write it into the chat.
As we wait for folks to raise their hand, oh, we have someone, Heidi. I just wanted to say, Rabbi Tuchman, that when you were talking about Judaism being something that we all have access to, I saw multiple people giving thumbs up. So that idea resonated.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you.
We'll ask Heidi to unmute.
Hi. Oh. Hi, thank you. I was looking at the word Hayom and I was saying to myself, well, that's interesting that would be there. I took it as an emphasis because it's not like the first time we're being told to, do mitzvot, and I took it to mean that in the here and now, no matter what I did yesterday, if I feel I fell short yesterday, Hayom, I can do better. And I just wanted to know what other reasons you can speak to as to why the word Hayom is there.
Yeah, Heidi, I love that question. And I'm so glad you asked, because we were going to definitely go there. So thank you. Yeah, Hayom is really emphasized, as you named, in our Parsha this week. I think from a literary perspective, the reason it is because this is really Moshe's conclusion, right? If we think about the book of Deuteronomy as this long series of speeches that Moses is giving, which is really interesting to think about Moses giving these very lengthy speeches, given that he calls himself a man of few words, but that's for another shiur. But if we think about, Deuteronomy as this very, very lengthy book of speeches, this is Moses basically saying, like, all right, this is it. Today, here we are. This is the day in which I am concluding this entire oratory. So I think that from a literary perspective, that's why Hayom is there. And I also very much agree with you that Hayom, Torah traditionally is understood to be eternally relevant in every generation, and that we, and this is my own theology, so I invite people to take it or leave it, or whatever resonates. But whatever we make of it, right? Each generation has to, in some ways, kind of renew our relationship to Torah. And so, as you were saying, Hayom, today, like every day is an opportunity to engage. Every single day is an opportunity to kind of dive more deeply in. And I don't know about all of you, but I for sure had intentions in the beginning of Elul, and some of those intentions didn't pan out in the way that I would have wanted them to pan out for lots of reasons. Like life gets in the way, things happen. And in those moments, I can invite myself into saying, Hayom, today, even if I didn't feel like I did it yesterday or the day before, I can start a different kind of practice today. I can renew those intentions today. I can renew my connection with Torah today. So I think that emphasis is partially Moshe's, or what's the word? Oratoric. I don't know if that's a word, like oratory. I think part of that is Moshe's oratory. And I think part of it is really a reminder in every generation, because Moshe says in this Parsha, or however we understand, I'm saying that is that from a, traditional perspective, not, not assuming that that's what anybody believes. It's not necessarily what I believe myself either, but like just kind of referring to the Torah as the Torah refers to itself. This notion of the covenant is here. These things are happening today, on this day, in this moment, and reminding us that the covenant and all of this is beyond the current moment. So that also means that today is literally right now, this moment.
We have some more hands. I'm curious if you'd like to hear from more folks, or you'd like
I
to.
would love to. Yes,
Okay.
please. And I'd love to hear from people like in a row, and then I will respond at the end.
Okay, we'll go to Rochelle and then Raphael.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. I love your teachings. I always am in awe for a couple of days after your Torah studies. I have a question for you, and it is the intermediaries. I think that in you can disagree, but I think that's one of the beautiful things about Judaism, is that you don't need the intermediary to go to the divine. You have that in your heart, and it's for all people. If you seek the divine, hey, the divine is right there. And I would just like your comment on how we differ from so many other religions.
Yeah, you know what? I'm going to take that first. Thank you so much, and then we'll go to Raphael, if that's okay. So I think that is something that Judaism brings that is extraordinary. I very much resonate with what you said, and I think, I am a meditation practitioner as well. I do a lot of Jewish meditation practice, and one of the things that is often talked about there is, again, that the practice, that the access to the divine is right here within, as you beautifully said. And I'm not an expert on other traditions, so I want to be careful in how I respond. But I do think that something that makes us really particularly unique is that our understanding of the divine, we have an incorporeal understanding of the divine. So the divine does not have a body. Now, you may be familiar in our prayer books and in other places, there are ways in which God gets referred to as, with God's right hand. Particularly, I'm even thinking of the Song of the Sea. And we deeply understand that to be a metaphor and not literal. And I am fully channeling my inner Rambam right now as I was saying that, Rabbi Moses Maimonides, Moshe ben Maimon, was very much about reminding us that, ours is a tradition that where God is deeply incorporeal, without a body, without a physical form. And we, the the relationship between the human being and God, even because we don't have that physical form, we have metaphors because human beings, we need some way of understanding that which is greater than us. And so, as we'll see in the Machzor next week, for those of us who will be in synagogue, there's going to be a lot of reference to God as Melech, especially on Rosh Hashanah, because Rosh Hashanah is understood as, in rabbinic parlance, as the coronation of God. And I want to invite, if anyone is not familiar, I think I might have mentioned this in another My Jewish Learning teaching I did recently, so apologies. But there is a absolutely beautiful book by Rabbi Toba Spitzer, Toba Spitzer, called God is Here. It's gorgeous. It is this beautiful book inviting us to understand the divine through very Jewish ideas. God as Sewer, God as rock, God as Hamakom, which is one of my favorite names for the divine. In Judaism, we have many, many, many names for the divine. Hamakom is the place. Sur is rock or foundation. There are just so many of them, and I think that for Judaism, traditionally, we just deeply believe that revelation between revelation of Torah happened with the entire people. That is a key belief that we have that actually gets reiterated in our parsha this week when we're reminded that we were all standing, we're all present here this day, those with us and those who are not with us. And that is where we have the notion that every single soul of the Jewish people, past, present, future, was at Sinai. And this is particularly an idea that a lot of people who embrace Judaism at different points in their lives, whether they grew up in a Jewish family or converted to Judaism at some point in their life, this is a beautiful image of saying your neshama, your essence, your soul was Jewish all along. It was present at Sinai. And some people have an easier path to Judaism. Some people are born into it in one way or another. And others are, others take a little bit longer, but everyone ultimately was at Sinai. And there is that spiritual pull that a lot of people who choose Judaism feel, like a really, really deep, it almost makes me think about how in this Pasha, the idea of the covenant is right here in your mouth and in your heart. And it can feel really, really close. Like it's not an intellectual choice. It's actually a really deeply embodied, beautiful experience. I think that that's something that that's how I'll speak to our tradition. There are other traditions, and I don't want to speak for them because I'm not, that's not my tradition, but we don't have a notion of a triune. That's very much not part of who we are as Jews. The notion of a Trinity, that is a non-Jewish idea. We don't have we do have in Kabbalah the notion of sfirot, but again, that is not literal. Those are metaphoric, right? Those are emanations. Those are ways of understanding how God is in the world. Those are not about God as an embodied being. God is deeply not a physical bodily being. God is that which is greater and beyond us. So a little bit longer answer than you might have expected. Sorry about that. Let's move on to our next question.
Great. Thank you, Rabbi. We'll go to Raphael and then to Susie.
Thanks. Rabbi, are the ger mentioned in verse 10 literally proselytes who dwell in the Kahal?
I think the Gerim in verse 10, usually in the Torah, the Gerim are often intended to be those who are not of the Jewish people, but who have been living with the Jewish people. So not necessarily converts in the way that we think of today, although the word ger has become understood colloquially as converts. But I think in this context, in the biblical context, we're referring to people who are sojourners, people who are not of the, who are not necessarily part of the Jewish people directly, but who are casting their lots. So that's the way that I would understand ger in that context.
Great. We'll go to Susie and then Jay.
It's not allowing me. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes,
Okay,
we
thank
can
you.
hear you. Yep.
Thank you, Rabbi. I'm really appreciating this teaching. And I just wanted to emphasize something you said not very long ago. I had the great privilege once of hearing Rebbitzin Esther Jungreis speak here in Toronto. And she talked about the Pindel Yid in every Jew. I don't speak Yiddish, but it's the little flame. And it's what you were saying,
Yes.
that it's all in all of us. We just come to it differently, but that little flame burns quietly until we fan it or feed it.
Exactly. That idea of the pencil, yeah, exactly. That spark, right? That it's there. And as you said, we get to it in lots of different unique ways, but it's there and it's available to all of us. Absolutely.
Thank you, Susie. Jay, you should now be able to unmute.
Thank you. So I had a couple of questions in chapter 30, verse 10. It's talking about the commandments, plural. But then on the next verse 11, it says this commandment. So I was confused about that. And one other question was, it talks about the commandments being available on both sides of the sea. Does that mean that when the Jews were in Egypt, that the commandments were available to them?
Love those questions. And to the first one about the mitzvotav versus mitzvahazot, right? The plural and then the singular.
Right.
I think, the rabbis say that there is not a single, I'm thinking about Rabbi Akiva in particular, the Rabbi Akivan school of Torah analysis. There are lots of them, but two of the most important ones in the time of the Mishnah, particularly, were that of Yishmael and Akiva. And there is a certain way in how the disciples of Rabbi Akiva understood the Torah. As one of my very beloved professors, Rabbi Dr. Bertozzatsky, taught that, every jot and tittle, every bit of every letter was omnisignificant. So everything is significant. There's no accident. That's a very traditional understanding of Torah. I come at it from a slightly different perspective in the sense that, when I say different perspective, I mean directly from Rabbi Akiva, in that I think that a lot of times it's a literary device, that when we're talking about this mitzvah, we're referring to the entire covenant, and it's a oratorical device. But I would really encourage anyone who's interested in any kind of Hasidic commentaries, traditional commentaries, like ways of really parsing that, to go and look, because you'll find a lot of rabbinic commentary that will talk about, every word matters and these grammatical changes matter. So that's one piece. And then to your second question about the sea, I think we're talking about here is actually not about Egypt specifically. I think the metaphor is being brought of, you don't have to go to the other side of the sea, whatever that means. Perhaps we're talking about this notion, the way that I've understood it, and I think there are lots of ways to understand it. The way that I've understood that is, you might think that there's a huge chasm, a huge expanse between you and Torah. And the metaphor of the sea is used there. And I think it's a really purposeful metaphor, because it's inviting us to kind of hearken back to the Red Sea, to the Sea of Reeds. But I think what's actually being invited there is this notion of, there is this massive gap between you and Torah. And Moses is saying, no, that's not the case. And I think that can be backed up because earlier in our Parsha, we have a scenario which feels so deeply human. And that's why this is one of my favorite Parshiot, where basically Moshe is talking about this covenant, and we're all part of it, and everyone's part of it. And but there might be some people who, they feel like they aren't part of it, or like, they're gonna kind of do their own thing. I'm like thinking about, the free spirits among us, which, like, I myself sometimes think of myself as a little bit of a free spirit, and I think that there is a lot of like space for free spirits in the world. But there's this kind of like interesting idea here of like, you think that maybe you feel like this doesn't apply to you. And if you feel like there's no room for you here, right? If you feel like there's really no room, then you might think that you're good to go. But actually, right? Actually, the Parsha says, no, you're part of this. You're included in this covenant. It reminds me, and I don't have it with me because I hadn't planned to share it, but one of my teachers, Rabbi Dorothy Richmond, years ago put out an album on Bandcamp, which is just gorgeous. She has this beautiful rendition of Psalm 27, which is particularly appropriate right now. But on this really beautiful album, it's called Something of Mine. There's a track on there called Enough Room. And it's this really just simple and sweet song that is all about there is enough room for you, for me, right? That we're all part of this. And that really comes up for me in this parsha, because I think that that's the point that's being made, that in fact, it's not away, it's not far from you. You don't have to traverse the sea to get it. It's actually right here. And so it's not necessarily saying it would have been accessible to you in Egypt. I think it's actually saying you might think on a spiritual level or on a psychological level that there's like this big gap that you can't get across, but actually that's not the case.
Thank you very much.
Of course.
Very helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions, either verbally or in the chat? I'd love to take a couple at a time.
There's always a string of commentary in the chat, but not really seeing so many questions. But maybe if someone
any interesting comments?
Let's see. I know earlier there were people who were talking about clouds and fire as are they only metaphors, or it's Juliet here who asks, do you think the fire and cloud are metaphors only, or are they physical? Are they in existence?
My inclination is to say metaphors, but there are 70 faces to Torah, meaning like there are infinite numbers of interpretations. So for sure, I would encourage folks to read up on that. My initial inclination is to say that that is a metaphor, and that's again kind of an oratorical. I hope that's the right word. An oratory, a metaphor for that.
Great. As we approach our final 5 minutes, I just want to say to you, Rabbi, at the end, I will ask you to share a bracha with all those here. So if you need a few minutes to think about what that'll be, that's great. And also, we'd really love to hear from new folks if maybe you've been a little bit shy, or a question has been percolating that you're not sure if you should ask or not. Now is a great time. Darcy's asking an interesting question, and then we'll go to Gail, who has your hand raised. Darcy is asking if everyone can go directly to God, why were the priests instituted in the temple? Which I think is a relevant question, and we'll ask Gail to unmute to ask your question.
Hi, two things. Well, one, I just really wanted to thank you because this is so beautiful and I always love your teachings. But two, one way to read this, and I'm not sure if this is correct, is are we supposed to be doing all the commandments every day?
Yeah, thank you, Gail. That's a beautiful question. That's I hadn't actually thought about it in that way. I think that there are lots of different ways to understand the relationship between the individual and mitzvot. And the truth is, there are 613 mitzvot. There were a lot of medieval philosophies that kind of counted the mitzvot and got to 613. And in those 613, no individual can do all of them. One of my teachers, Rabbi Lappi, taught me years and years and years ago that her understanding, which speaks with me to an extent, of the notion of the mitzvot are a communal project, right? That we actually carry them. Those are my words, not hers, but I understood what she said to be like, the mitzvot are a communal endeavor, right? That not everyone does every mitzvah. That is just practically, right? Not every person is actually, and a lot of the mitzvot are not operative today. So, without the temple, particularly, there are a lot of the mitzvot that we are not actually able to do in their most direct form because we don't have the temple. So, that having been said, what I really love to invite people into doing is really, I think that, I have a deep love and a deep relationship with mitzvot, and I think they're really central to how I live a Jewish life. And I think there are these amazing ways of connection. And I really want to invite us. There's an idea in Judaism as well that even as the mitzvot are, belong to all of us, and some of us have an idea of chiyuv or obligation, that they're incumbent, and others of us aren't, don't feel bound by obligation in the same way. But there's still, regardless, there's an idea that everyone kind of has that mitzvah that really, really resonates. And actually, that's going to lead directly into my bracha for everyone. That everyone has that particular mitzvah that really resonates, and it just calls to your neshama, whatever that is. And maybe it's not so obvious what that mitzvah is. And that's great. That's totally okay, right? And maybe that mitzvah changes. I don't think it's constant, right? Like, there are definitely times when there are some mitzvot that really draw me. And then there are times when I'm drawn by other mitzvot in a much more personal and intimate way. And that's the bracha that I actually want to leave us with. And then I'll very briefly address the important question about the priests in the temple. But actually, I'm going to do that real quick, and then I'll close us out. I think it's a really interesting tension. I think that there are certain ways in which, particularly with the sacrificial system, and especially in Deuteronomy, there's a huge emphasis in Deuteronomy on the centralization of the worship in Yerushalayim, in Jerusalem. And I think that that's an important tension to think about. Why are the priests there? They're doing a particular religious function, and the covenant is right here. Meaning, I think one way to understand that is we are all part of that covenant. We are not only reliant on the priests, that even with the priests in the time that they were had more religious function than they do today, Kohanim really don't have, by and large, the same functionality that they used to. Even when they had that, when there was that service, the lay person still had that covenant and that covenantal access. So I think that there's a tension between the functionality, the actual sacrifices, and the ability for the individual to come close to God. I think that those two are both present and that they both have a role. And so I'm just going to wrap us up with a blessing, which is that I hope that in 5785, after this really, really very, very trying year that we've all had, that we're really able to find that mitzvah, that entryway into this tradition, or maybe deepening, and that we're able to kind of find our own little piece of it, our own little portion in Torah. That's my blessing for all of us, that we're able to enter the new year with an intention of kind of finding our own little space in this really vastness that is Torah, that is the Jewish tradition.
Amen. Thank you so much, Rabbi. Thank you all.
Amen.
Shalom.
Amen. Thank you so much.
Shalom, everybody.
Shabbat shalom.
Shalom.
Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat shalom.